Thank you. Thank you for that great introduction. Although, one thing I'll say today, this is something that we've been rolling out for a few months now. Even though I'm honored and privileged to be known as a data guy, what I'm going to be talking about today is how it's important to go beyond data. It's a new framework that we're rolling out that we are calling DNA, which is data, narrative, and action. And this is built out of the work at the Center for Social Innovation, which I started a year and a half ago at UC Riverside. And let me just say a little bit about the center. And there's a reason why I'm doing this, right? So at the center, we focus on growing investments in inland California. When you ask people to put pins on a map in terms of where is innovation happening, so when we launched as a Center for Social Innovation, it was a little surprising. People are like, innovation in Riverside, really? Right? You ask people to drop pins on a map. Where is innovation happening? By the way, you can say this for the country, too. People put a whole bunch of dots in the Bay Area. Right? If they think about entertainment technology, they'll put a whole bunch of dots in LA and Silicon Beach, which is a thing, by the way. Or they'll put a bunch of dots in Biotech Beach down in San Diego area. But they're not going to put pins in the middle of California. Right? The dominant narrative for inland California is not of opportunity, it's not of innovation, it's of problems, it's of challenges, it's of corruption. By the way, all these issues are there in coastal California too, but that's not their dominant narrative. So what we try to do is to change that narrative, to focus on the change makers, to focus on the innovators, to say that these are the people that you need to invest in and to produce the kind of change that we need to see in society. Now, what does this have to do with Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, you might ask? And sometimes I find myself in a little bit of a whiplash because I do a lot of place-based work in California, but also continue our AAPI work. But there are a lot of similarities. So the Inland Empire is east of LA, right? And so we're in the shadow of a much larger entity. It's just really hard for people to pay attention to us. Does that sound familiar? Right? We know that we're important as communities of color, but we're much smaller than other larger communities, and it's really hard to get our message across. The Inland Empire also has a very under-resourced nonprofit sector. Again, something that should be very familiar to everyone in this audience. We're trying to do so much with so little and suffer as a result of it. And then finally, and importantly, in our region, our philanthropy is not proportionate either to the need or to our giving capacity. And again, strong parallels to our community, right? Whenever we see data that talk about the kind of the wealth and the income, high incomes among Asian Americans, that wealth is not being used in a productive way as far as philanthropy is concerned. So that's something that we think is relevant in both of our contexts, but so are the solutions, right? In terms of trying to get more attention, I'll talk about strategic narrative work. We can talk later on about nonprofit leadership and innovation, as well as innovation and philanthropy. So this framework that I'm talking about today is data, narrative, and action. This is something that we developed while we were doing a leadership training program in the Inland Empire. And we asked people, what's your DNA? And by this, we don't want everyone to go get a 23andMe test, right? That's not the point of this. What that means is, what is your data plan? What is your action? What is your narrative plan? And what is your action plan? Often people come up to me and say, hey, can you give me data? It's like, yeah, but what are you trying to achieve? That actually should be the first thing you're trying to figure out. The strategic action that you want to take is the first thing you want to know. Because there's so much data, especially today. We're swimming in an ocean of data. You need to figure out what your strategic action is and then go find the data that you need to make your case. Now, this is not the way, if there are any PhD students in the room, this is not the way you should do PhD research, right? This is like strategic action research, right? PhD research, you start with the question and you search for all the kind of data and evidence that you can. But this is in the case where you already know what you want to do. Although data could provide insights that can inform strategic action, right? It could be a bit circular in terms of how this works. But you can't just stop with data. The way I say it and others say it, data, first of all, you need data because if you just have stories, and sometimes it can be really strong, compelling stories, public policymakers, they'll just see that as anecdotal evidence. They'll want to know, can you give me something more systematic? If you're talking about poverty in the Asian American community, can you tell me where it's happening? Can you tell me which communities are affected? If you're talking about language needs, can you tell me which communities have the strongest language needs? You need to have that data. But it can't just be about numbers, because if it's just data without narrative, and I'll say a little bit about what narrative means, but without narrative, our needs are not memorable. Our asks are not sticky, right? So you need narrative in order to be memorable, in order for our needs to be taken more seriously and to have that emotional appeal tied to it. And then finally, action, right? So action can involve advocacy, it can involve civic engagement, it can involve philanthropy. Let me just say a little bit about a couple of examples of how this has worked in the work that we do. So first of all, if you go to AAPI data, you'll find a lot of different resources, including this report that we did with Center for American Progress that started us off several years ago. And what we do is to try to provide more ready access to data, especially from the US Census Bureau, that is just really hard to find. So you'll find that through our different data tools. API data started off with just me and Sono, and we were a small but mighty team. We got a ton of media coverage, especially because we worked with mainstream organizations like Center for American Progress. It was important for us to not just partner with other AAPI groups, but also to make sure that our voices are being heard in the mainstream. Now we have Professor Jennifer Lee, who's at Columbia, Janelle Wong, who's at University of Maryland nearby, and then Sunny Shao, who's also joined us as a PhD student at UCR. We try to make data playful, so you'll find this on our API data site under community profiles. We've just launched a few months ago, it's a soft launch of racial data, where it's possible not only to pull down data on Asian American and Pacific Islander populations, but also on other communities of color. And we allow the possibility, it's kind of like, when you compare cars side by side, you can compare different demographic groups side by side, and then you can download it either as an Excel file or as a PDF. So we try to make this as easy to use as possible. But again, our work goes beyond data. So one example that I like to use is data that we have on undocumented Asians. This is not our data. We rely on reports that others have generated in terms of trying to estimate the Asian undocumented population. And a lot of people talk in terms of big numbers, 1.5 million, 1.7 million Asian Americans who are undocumented. That's a powerful figure, but for a lot of people, once you start talking in the millions, they really don't know what sense to make of it. How big is this in our community? We don't really know. So what we did is actually I can do advanced statistics. This was like one of the most basic arithmetic things you could do, right? Which is select the numerator and select the denominator. Numerator is Asian undocumented, denominator is Asian foreign born. But when you put that together, you come up with a headline like this, that 1 out of every 7 Asian immigrants is undocumented. How many people knew that factoid before today? So if you know it, it's because of our work, because no one was doing it before we did it. And now you have members of Congress saying it. And once you know that, it's really hard to not remember that anymore. 7's a lucky number, right? You'll remember 7. So 1 out of 7 Asian immigrants is undocumented, and that's powerful. It's powerful because often we don't recognize how important this issue is within our community. We have a very distorted view of who Asian immigrants are. By the way, when they talked about cutting family visas, right, Senator Cotton and the RAISE Act, the Trump administration is doing that. We put out a blog post reminding Asian Americans that a majority of Asian immigrants still coming into the country today, right, getting green cards are doing so because of family visas. We have a very distorted view of how Asian Americans are coming in. And cuts to family visas will affect us disproportionately. But because we don't recognize this reality, we are not rising up to action the way that we should. Important part of this narrative work, not only are we shaping the way members of Congress talk about this issue, when President Obama announced the expansion of deferred action for childhood arrivals, as well as deferred action for parents of Americans, this was in November 2014, Migration Policy Institute put out a bunch of state estimates. What we did immediately was that very day, we created a whole bunch of infographics. And these infographics are very, very simple infographics. It was just an outline of a state, talking about the number of Asian American undocumented and what proportion of the undocumented they represented and what proportion of the Asian immigrant population they represented. What we benefited from was a positive echo chamber within AAPI communities. People were circulating our graphics on social media through Twitter, and a lot of journalists are on Twitter, right? So through Twitter and also through Facebook. And within 2 days, I had a call from NPR Weekend Edition and did an interview with Scott Simon. And that was important, right? Important so that national listeners realize that undocumented immigrants are not just Latino. This is an issue that affects our community, and it's important for people to pay attention. That's the kind of important narrative work that matters. Similarly, Crazy Rich Asians, when it came out. By the way, I think it should be called Crazy Rich Chinese. Right? I mean, right? And by the way, I just stopped by Singapore on my way back from India, and yeah, there are a fair number of brown people in Singapore that you didn't see on screen. But that was an important moment, right? Pew had actually put out a note showing how income inequality was strongest among Asian Americans and how it had skyrocketed in 30 years, with immigration having a lot to do with it. But because we had done so much data work and also connections with journalists, Jennifer Lee and I got quoted in this story. And this was, the front section of Sunday New York Times. So it was pretty important placement for the kind of narrative work that we're trying to do. So let me just talk about some key narrative opportunities, but also challenges. Anytime we say why, anytime we try to make a case for why we matter, we go with the growth statistics, which is fine, right? That's important. We are the fastest growing racial groups in the country. Someone might ask, well, how big are you? Well, we're not as large as Latinos, but we're the fastest growing. You also have significant increases in purchasing power. For folks that are, this slide deck is available on our website if you go under multimedia presentation. So you don't need to snap away, or you can snap away if you want. So we're already at $1 trillion in terms of consumer purchasing power. And so that's important. This is the kind of data that Nielsen uses, for example, to convince corporations that they should advertise to Asian Americans. This is from a report in the St. Louis from the St. Louis Federal Reserve, where Asian Americans are growing in terms of their wealth generation. And within a decade or so, we will reach parity with whites in terms of wealth creation, in terms of our net worth. Big difference, by the way. I just offer Latinos there as a contrast, but African Americans are near zero, right, in terms of their net worth. In terms of businesses with over $1 million in receipts, you see robust growth in Asian American-owned businesses. So what's the problem? Right? This is kind of like the Pew report that came out in 2012, which talked about all these amazing things. We're the fastest growing, we're the richest, we're the happiest. America, watch out. Like that pretty much was the headline. And of course, AAPI serving organizations threw a fit because there's a lot of diversity within our community that gets ignored when you pay attention to those aggregate numbers, right? What I showed you so far was just racial group data where all of the differences within our community get smushed together as an average. Just like Tina said, it's important when you talk about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders that we have to speak to the breadth of our community. This is where unity comes in. Unity does not mean let's ignore our differences. Unity actually means pay attention to those most disadvantaged and make sure that you're raising their outcomes too, right? And that's so important to keep in mind. And this is something that I think in some of my sharper moments, and I don't say this publicly, well, at least to larger audiences beyond AAPI communities, if any organization says that it's an Asian American organization or an AAPI organization, we better damn make sure that we're actually advocating for the most disadvantaged among us. Because otherwise, if you're an Indian American organization, call yourself an Indian American organization. If you're a Chinese American organization, call yourself a Chinese American organization. Don't claim to speak on Asian American or AAPI interests if you have a very narrow interest that you're pushing. That is so important, right? Because then people can see through that. People can actually see through what a particular interest looks like. This is why, by the way, data disaggregation is important, and I'll talk about that in a second. Disaggregation is important because if you look, for example, some of the populations that may be doing very well in terms of educational attainment, and I apologize for the size of the screen here, but if you look at Chinese Americans, for example, score pretty high in terms of bachelor's degree attainment, but they also score high in terms of limited English proficiency, right? And that's important because there's a lot of controversy, especially in the Chinese immigrant community, but why are we disaggregating the data? There's somehow this distorted notion that if you check off a box on the census form or in the American Community Survey, you're not getting into Harvard. That's not the way college admissions works. It has nothing to do with census data, right? But yet, you have this very, very strong view. And by the way, some of these groups are consulting with Ward Connerly, who pushed the end of affirmative action in California and tried to push a companion effort that failed. The belief is that somehow by collecting data on race and ethnicity, that's what produces racism in our country. Such a fundamental misunderstanding how racism works in our country. No one needs to see that you checked off a box to discriminate against you, right? And yet you have these false prophets pushing this message, especially on WeChat, and organizing people under this very false notion that actually harms our community. And I'll talk about that in a second. By the way, it's important to disaggregate among Pacific Islanders too, whenever possible, because you see variation there as well. But these are some of the things. When you look at activism, especially in the Chinese immigrant community over the last few years, it's protesting data disaggregation. This is something that our community has fought for 3 decades for. First time I saw that, it just blew my mind. I see a couple of commissioners. I chair the California Commission on AAPIs. We had supported a data disaggregation bill because we had several populations, especially Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander populations, but also Chinese immigrant populations. If you're trying to make the case that a hospital has to provide Chinese language assistance in some remote county in the country, if you do not have that census data, you cannot make that case, right? And many of these counties, the sample sizes are too small for them to rely on the American Community Survey. I'm just nerding out here for a second, right? You need that census data to hold those county hospitals accountable. And you cannot do that without checking off the Chinese box, which is why it's really disturbing. Many of you have seen this signature gathering effort, as well as a complaint, formal complaint filed with the Department of Justice saying that you should get rid of Asian checkboxes. It is just utter insanity, right? So I would say, how many folks here are on WeChat? You have to be part of the solution. We have to turn this message around. Because by failing to check off the Chinese box, what that means, first of all, talk about political power. Good luck trying to make the case that Chinese Americans matter. On top of that, your chance of getting into Harvard is still going to be low. Everyone's chances of getting into Harvard are still going to be low, right? And then your uncles and aunties and grandparents who are trying to get language assistance while they go to an emergency room will be jeopardized if you don't do this. These are the kind of messages we need to push within, especially mediums like WeChat, to make sure that we're getting the message across. By the way, Census 2020, Asian Americans are those least likely to say they're going to fill out the census. That is a major problem. We cannot even say that we matter if we don't show up for census. Part of that is because of the misinformation campaign that is going on, but it's also we have the highest share of recent immigrants. You have a big chunk of our population that was not around here in 2010. And so what this means for philanthropy, for example, I sit on the board of the California Endowment, is that we need to invest not only in Latino outreach, but also Asian American outreach, right? We need to be paying attention to our populations. As Tina had said, census is so critical, and what I have here is a graphic that some of you might have seen when I gave this presentation in Silicon Valley a couple of months ago. Census is part of a nexus of activities that all relate to empowerment, right? And if you look, starting now through 2021, there's census outreach, then you need to start shifting to voter registration, and then to get out the vote in 2020, contacting public officials, attending public hearings. Redistricting in 2021 is going to be so important. The kind of gerrymandering that happened a decade ago really has hurt our communities as well as others, running for office, and then finally engaging in philanthropy. I will throw up some numbers because people asked for some numbers, so Joy, I will give some numbers here. 2016 did see some record gains. So we doubled our normal increase in a presidential cycle in terms of new voters coming in. So that's one promising sign. Although there still are some racial gaps, some of those gaps are getting narrower. If you look at the midterm elections, this is a blog post that we're going to be putting out later on today, so watch out for that on API data. 2018 also saw some big increases, right? Overall, including among Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Like, look at that number, right? Asian American turnout, this is voting among adult citizens, was 28% in 2014. It jumped to 42% in 2018. So you combine what happened in 2016 when Trump was first on the ballot to what happened in 2018. 2020 is probably going to be a record turnout for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. But it just doesn't automatically happen, right? We have to focus on voter registration. We have to focus on turnout. We also have differences across groups. And for some groups, like for Indian Americans and Filipinos, you saw some very dramatic increases. But you saw increases across the board, except for Vietnamese Americans, where you saw about the same level of voter turnout in 2018 as you saw in 2014. We also see some important differences by state. And this is where the geographic diversity of a room like this, I think, is important to pay attention to. We should think of like a friendly competition across states. If you look at different APAPA chapters, for example, right? Like if you're from New York State, you guys really need to step it up. Or Nevada, you know? Like it's kind of pitiful how low Asian American turnout in those states are. If you're in Washington State or Virginia, you guys are doing a good job. Continue doing that great work. But it's not just about voting, right? Other aspects of empowerment also matters. We also need to step up our game when it comes to philanthropy. And this is the project that I personally am going to be focused on for the next 5 years. One of the things that worries me, I live in California. What worries me is how low philanthropic participation is among Asian Americans. And why it worries me is that the future of California, especially if you look at the upper middle class to the wealthy population, we're seeing a replacement of wealthy whites with wealthy Asian Americans. But if we are not stepping up in philanthropy in that same way, that social compact, the kind of things that make society run, is at risk. And that really worries me. But beyond that, if I had to make a selfish case, why should someone get involved in philanthropy? Why should we be thinking about philanthropy? 2 reasons. One is if you're talking about influence, we cannot be as influential as we could be if we do not engage in philanthropy, right? That's an important part of social influence. And 2, our philanthropy needs to be part of a framework of what I call enlightened self-interest. And what that means is that we should not only, of course, we can start by giving to causes that affect, say, in my case, Indian Americans, say, and then Asian Americans. But we have to go beyond that, because part of the stereotype that harms Asian Americans is that we only care about our own. And that's a dangerous place to be if you're one of these quote-unquote middleman minorities, in which we're doing pretty well economically, but either people that are downtrodden or people in power think that we only care about ourselves. By the way, this is something that Steve Bannon said a few years ago in trying to call for major cutbacks in Asian immigration. He said a society is not just about economics, right? This is when Trump was on the phone with him on Breitbart Radio, saying, yeah, maybe we want to keep the college graduates here. And Bannon said, no, but a society is more than just about economics. We need people civically engaged. I'm not saying that I'm endorsing Steve Bannon at all. But you know how the logic of this works. If you have a group that is economically successful and not civically engaged, things can get dangerous really quick. I'll give you an example from the Bay Area. There's actually very little systematic data on philanthropy. We have these general statistics that APIs get less than 1% of philanthropy dollars. But part of this problem is of our own making. So in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Chronicle, between Thanksgiving and Christmas every year, they have this pledge campaign to fundraise for people that are less fortunate. And Buck G, a colleague and friend, tallied up these donations and classified them according to whether they were an Asian donor or not. And the results were pretty eye-popping. So if you look at the Asian American population in San Francisco and San Mateo counties, this is the audience for the Chronicle. Asian Americans are 32% of the population. If you look at the population with incomes over 100,000, 28% of that population. So if we were proportional in our giving, you could expect maybe about a quarter of all donors to that pledge drive would have been Asian American. Anyone want to take a guess as to what the real number was? 1%. So if you're anyone that's, say, trying to address the homeless population or the disabled or even language access, you can see how worried they will be in terms of what the future of philanthropy is going to look like, right? And this can be reproduced in other cities across the country, New York, Chicago, Houston, many of the places where you serve. So we have to step it up in terms of our philanthropic engagement. Fortunately, there are some efforts to make a difference. Recently, there was a National Asian American Community Foundation that just launched. They're still trying to gain their footing in terms of figuring out how exactly they're going to show up. In different metropolitan areas, like in San Francisco, like in LA, like in New York, you do have examples of funds, community funds that have emerged to try to do more to help our communities. But we all need to step up our game. When we think about empowerment, we have to go beyond this very narrow notion that it's just about ourselves. We also, I'm not saying that voting doesn't matter. Voting, of course, matters. It's one of the fundamental things that we need to make sure that we increase. By the way, typically speaking, when we talk about Asian American turnout in presidential elections, our turnout rates are in the low 50s. If we were grading, that would be an F, right? This is one of the things that Sue Van says, is like, I've never been last. We are not used to Fs, we're supposed to get As, right? Like, so we have to, like, we are failing when it comes to civic engagement. And our elected officials know it. They do not take us as seriously if we do not turn out to vote. But that's just one important step. In fact, what we will see is as we get more civically engaged, many of these other things also start falling into place. So I'll end it at that, but happy to answer any questions. There's a lot more data that I'm not showing. Actually, one thing I'll just say, is there an Asian American agenda? A lot of people ask that. So I'll just give you kind of quick, if someone says, what are 3 things that we're about? I'll just say there are 3 themes that we have found with all of the years of survey data that we've analyzed. One is that we believe in an inclusion agenda. Immigrant rights, language access. A lot of people care about representation and entertainment. Some of us folks who are older might be like, really? You're going to care so much about what Hollywood does? It's like, yes, it matters, and it's part of this theme of inclusion. And also representation in corporate leadership. Another major agenda or theme you can think of is protection. This is something that is really untapped. We've known now for about 5 years that gun control is a major issue among Asian Americans. If you're trying to appeal, especially in a competitive electoral context, gun control is huge. Environmental protection. We have very strong environmental values. So when people say, I care about environmental voters, they should also care about Asian American voters. And then healthcare. Healthcare was so big in 2016 and 2018, and it's going to be big again in 2020. And then finally, opportunity. So this is about education, and it's not about the Harvard lawsuit. I'm sorry, folks, right? It's not. Because even in California, so much attention to Berkeley and UCLA, the majority of Asian Americans in California are in the community college system. So if you say that you care about education, you better be involved in community college districts. And I see a community college professor in the back there, right? It's not just about the elite. It's not even reflective of our community. So again, I would say those who think that they're doing a service to our community by focusing on the Harvard lawsuit are actually doing it a disservice. It is not reflective of the vast majority of our population. So this is where I'm hoping that data can help inform us, actually hold a mirror to who we actually are, instead of having a distorted view of who we are. So when it comes to education, People can and should run for office like for school boards, right? And for local office. And the key themes are access. Asian Americans, our public opinion data show, people want access to good quality public schools. They want college to be affordable. They are worried about student debt, and they care about the quality of public education. These are the kind of things we should be running on, not some ultimately unhelpful pursuit of the very top when it comes to elite education, not paying attention to where our community is on this issue. I'll leave it at that. Happy to answer any questions.